August 1942. The humid air over Guadalcanal hung like wet cloth. Somewhere in the green silence a twig snapped, a small sound swallowed by the breathing jungle. A squad of Japanese soldiers froze. Their uniforms, once immaculate, were now streaked with mud and sweat. Mosquitoes swarmed around their faces. Every rustle of leaves seemed alive, whispering threats in the dark. For months they had advanced across the Pacific with certainty, victory after victory, discipline unbroken. But here, on this nameless trail between coconut palms and mangrove roots, something was different. The enemy was unseen. Their movements were silent, their presence constant. Bullets came from shadows. Artillery thundered from nowhere. The nights were long, filled with American voices, mocking laughter, and the eerie sound of soldiers who seemed to vanish into the forest after every ambush. Corporal Haruo Nakamura gripped his Arisaka rifle tighter. Sweat dripped into his eyes. He listened. No commands, no movement. Only the endless hum of insects, and then suddenly the mechanical cough of a Browning machine gun from deep within the trees. In an instant, the illusion of Japanese invincibility cracked. Guadalcanal would not be conquered. It would consume. What began as a small island campaign was becoming something far greater. A battle for survival in a jungle where fear itself took form. By mid-1942, the Pacific Ocean had become an empire of conquest. From the snowy slopes of the Aleutians to the steaming jungles of New Guinea, the Imperial Japanese forces seemed unstoppable. In just 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, they had overrun Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the great British fortress of Singapore. Everywhere the rising sun advanced, Allied resistance collapsed under speed, ferocity, and precision. Tokyo believed it had carved a defensive perimeter so vast that no Western army could breach it for years. But that illusion began to falter on one small, forgotten island in the southern Solomon chain, Guadalcanal. Located roughly 1,000 miles northeast of Australia, Guadalcanal was covered in dense jungle and bordered by swamps, coral reefs, and black sand beaches. To the Japanese, it was merely another point on the map until U.S. reconnaissance flights spotted something troubling in mid-1942, an airfield under construction by Japanese engineers. That strip of cleared jungle was about to change the war. If completed, it would allow Japan to threaten Allied shipping routes between the United States and Australia, lifelines critical for the survival of the Pacific Campaign. For Washington, the message was clear. The United States, still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor and the fall of the Philippines, needed to strike back, so it ended quickly. Operation Watchtower. On August 7, 1942, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps launched the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific War, Operation Watchtower. The target was simple but daring: capture Guadalcanal, seize the unfinished airfield, and deny Japan a base of operations in the southern Solomons. Under the command of Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher and Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift, nearly 11,000 Marines landed on the island's north coast. The Japanese defenders, mostly construction troops from the 11th and 13th Naval Landing Forces, were taken completely by surprise. Many fled into the jungle, abandoning food, weapons, and even the airfield itself. By nightfall, the Marines had captured the field, later renamed Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at Midway. It was the first American land victory of the Pacific War, but triumph was short-lived. The following day, Japanese naval aircraft from Rabaul struck back, bombing the beaches and anchorage. Then in the chaotic nights that followed, the U.S. Navy suffered heavy losses during the Battle of Savo Island, where Japanese cruisers ambushed and sank 4 Allied ships. The American fleet withdrew, leaving the Marines stranded, low on supplies, surrounded by jungle, and facing a furious counterattack. The Japanese reaction for the Imperial Japanese Army, Guadalcanal, was an insult that demanded immediate retribution. At first, Tokyo dismissed the invasion as a minor raid, but as reports confirmed the loss of the airfield, High Command ordered General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army to retake the island at all costs. What they underestimated was not American firepower, but the environment itself. The troops who sailed from Rabaul believed they would repeat the swift, decisive victories that had characterized Japan's early campaigns. Instead, they stepped into a nightmare of mud, fever, and confusion. Torrential rain turned the trails into rivers. Equipment rusted. Food spoiled. Every movement required hacking through choking vines and mud that swallowed boots to the ankle. The Marines, too, faced misery. Their rations ran short, their uniforms rotted in the humidity, and disease spread faster than ammunition could be resupplied. But unlike their enemy, they held the one critical advantage: control of Henderson Field. From that strip of jungle runway, American Cactus Air Force squadrons launched daily raids that battered Japanese shipping and troop convoys. What began as an isolated skirmish was hardening into a brutal war of attrition. In Tokyo, the defeat was unthinkable. Japan's military code demanded victory or death, not retreat. But on Guadalcanal, those ideals collided with an enemy who refused to yield, and an environment that seemed to devour all who entered it. The Imperial Command still believed the Americans were weak, untested and unprepared for jungle warfare. They would soon discover how wrong that belief was. For in the months ahead, it was not American soldiers who would break under pressure. It was the Japanese, facing for the first time an enemy who could fight, adapt, and survive in the same unforgiving darkness that had once been their advantage. And so the battle for Guadalcanal began in earnest, not as a swift campaign of conquest, but as a slow, grinding struggle for every inch of jungle and every breath of air. By late August 1942, Guadalcanal had transformed from a remote outpost into the focal point of the Pacific War. The U.S. Marines dug into their perimeter around Henderson Field, stringing barbed wire through coconut groves and machine gun nests along the Lunga perimeter. They were short on everything: ammunition, medical supplies, even food. Yet the one thing they refused to lose was the airfield. Every morning, American Wildcats and dauntless bombers thundered down its muddy strip, clawing into the sky to hunt Japanese ships that tried to approach the island. Each evening, the sound of their return offered reassurance, proof that they still held the line. But as night fell, the balance shifted. From the darkness of the sea, Japanese destroyers and the infamous Tokyo Express raced down the Slot, a narrow channel through the Solomon Islands. They brought reinforcements, supplies, and artillery, then vanished before dawn. Henderson Field was the Marines' lifeline. The Tokyo Express was Japan's. Each side was fighting not only the other but time itself. The Battle of Tenaru and the rising fear, the first major ground assault, came swiftly. On the night of August 21, 1942, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led nearly 900 men of his elite Ichiki detachment in a frontal assault across the Ilu River, known to the Americans as the Tenaru. Ichiki, who had been among the victors at Pearl Harbor and Wake Island, believed he faced only a few hundred Marines. What awaited him was a wall of machine guns, mortars, and artillery fire. For hours, the Japanese charged through open sand, screaming "Banzai" into the darkness. At dawn, the beach was littered with their bodies and over 800 dead. Only a handful survived. Ichiki, humiliated and surrounded, burned his regimental colors and took his own life. The myth of Japanese invincibility began to fracture that morning. For the first time in the Pacific War, U.S. Marines had stood firm and annihilated an elite Japanese force. Jungle, disease, and the enemy unseen as the weeks dragged on. Guadalcanal became more than a battlefield. It became a living organism. The heat was relentless. Rain fell in sheets, flooding foxholes and turning rifles to rust. Malaria swept through both armies. The Japanese called it tropical hell. The Americans called it simply the canal. The jungle favored no one. Visibility was measured in feet. Every sound echoed strangely. A cough, a twig snap, the distant rumble of artillery. Units vanished in the undergrowth. Patrols stumbled into ambushes and men disappeared without a trace. The Japanese, trained for fast assaults, found themselves trapped in an environment where speed was impossible, and stealth belonged to whoever moved slower. For the first time, the Imperial Army's psychological edge, its aura of fear, was eroding. Japanese soldiers who had once viewed death as an honorable release now began to fear the unseen enemy that stalked them day and night. The Marines fought in small, agile groups, setting traps, striking, and fading into the trees. The Americans were learning the jungle's language, and they were using it to turn the terrain against the invaders. The battle for the skies and seas by September. The struggle had expanded beyond the island itself. At sea, both navies clashed in a series of brutal engagements. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons, the Battle of Cape Esperance, and later, the massive naval battle of Guadalcanal. The Japanese Navy, superior in night combat and ship handling, inflicted heavy losses. But each victory came at a cost they could not sustain. For every transport sunk, for every destroyer lost, Japan's grip weakened. The United States, with its growing industrial might, could replace ships and aircraft faster than Japan could train new crews. In the skies above Henderson Field, dogfights became daily duels. American pilots like Major John L. Smith and Captain Marion Carl fought Japanese A-6M-0s in swirling battles over the jungle canopy. The Cactus Air Force, operating on fumes and spare parts, held the balance. Control of the air meant control of the sea, and that meant control of Guadalcanal. A war of endurance. By October, it was no longer a matter of quick victory. Both sides were starving, sick, and exhausted. Japanese troops received barely a handful of rice each day. Many resorted to eating roots or insects. American rations were little better, mostly canned meat and hardtack biscuits, but morale endured. The Marines could hear Tokyo Express ships offshore at night, yet they stayed. For the Japanese, the fear was new. They had always been the aggressor, decisive, unyielding, superior in morale. But here, for the first time, they met an enemy who would not break. An enemy who fought in the dark, in the rain, in silence. Guadalcanal was no longer just a military campaign. It had become a psychological one. And deep in the jungle, where the dead lay unburied and the air stank of rot, Japanese soldiers began to whisper something unthinkable among themselves, that perhaps this time they would not win. From that moment on, the war in the Pacific would never be the same. The myth of the invincible Japanese soldier had met its match, and the stage was set for one of the most harrowing turning points in the history of modern warfare. The human angle, the Marines who wouldn't break. The first men who landed on Guadalcanal were not yet the hardened legends history would later remember. Many were young, barely 20, with no experience of jungle fighting. They had been trained for amphibious assaults and garrison defense, not for months of isolation in a disease-ridden wilderness. Yet under constant shelling, sleepless nights and dwindling rations, the Marines adapted faster than anyone could have imagined. They built makeshift defenses from coconut logs, dug foxholes in the wet red clay, and learned to fight without visibility, listening for the click of a rifle bolt or the whisper of movement through ferns. They lived in mud, drank from rain barrels, and fought malaria with quinine and determination. When artillery shells screamed overhead, they crouched low and waited for the next wave. And when the Japanese charged at night, illuminated by flares and muzzle flashes, they held their fire until the enemy was almost upon them. Every sunrise that found them still alive was a victory. By September, their uniforms were torn, their boots rotted, and their bodies thinned by hunger. But their confidence and that fierce unspoken belief in one another had become their most powerful weapon. The longer they survived, the more the myth of Japanese invincibility crumbled. The enemy's perspective, fear in the imperial ranks for the Japanese soldiers arriving on Guadalcanal. The experience was unlike anything they had faced before. They came ashore expecting to drive the weak Americans into the sea, the same way they had crushed British, Dutch, and Filipino forces in the early months of the war. But the Marines they met were not colonial defenders or retreating garrisons. They were organized, disciplined, and unyielding. The Japanese soon discovered that frontal assaults, in their trademark tactic, were suicidal against well-dug American positions backed by artillery and air support. Those who survived the failed attacks were forced into the jungle, where starvation and disease became relentless enemies. Men who had sworn never to retreat found themselves crawling through the mud in search of food. Letters recovered later from Japanese corpses spoke of hopelessness, of nights filled with gunfire and screams, of bodies bloated in the heat, of a fear they had never known before. For an army steeped in the Bushido code of honor and death before surrender, fear was forbidden, yet it crept in silently, carried by the sounds of unseen Americans who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The environmental angle, the jungle as a living weapon. Guadalcanal, was not just a battlefield. It was an organism that consumed men and machines alike. The dense vegetation, constant rainfall, and tropical heat created conditions so harsh that even survival felt like defiance. The jungle swallowed supply lines, metal rusted overnight, corpses decayed within hours. Every breath was thick with humidity and the stench of rot. Soldiers learned to identify the smell of death long before they saw it. Insects infested everything: rations, wounds, and even the seams of uniforms. The Americans learned to move quietly, cutting narrow paths with machetes and marking trails with strips of cloth. The Japanese, more accustomed to open-field tactics and bayonet charges, found the environment alien. The jungle offered concealment but no comfort. It muffled sound and distorted distance. At night it became a maze of unseen dangers: snipers, ambushes, and the constant threat of malaria-carrying mosquitoes. More soldiers died from disease than bullets. The tropical climate became the true equalizer, an invisible third army that fought against both sides. The psychological angle, the shifting balance of fear before Guadalcanal. The Imperial Japanese Army carried an aura of invincibility. From Shanghai to Singapore, they had marched through Asia with ruthless efficiency. But on this island, the psychological current reversed. The Americans, who had once been viewed as soft and dependent on machines, revealed a brutal adaptability. They learned to fight in silence, to ambush, and to use fear itself as a weapon. Night raids by Marine patrols shattered Japanese nerves. Bodies left in the open were a grim reminder that even the jungle favored the patient and the disciplined. The Japanese began to lose their sense of mastery. Their commanders' orders to fight to the last man became impossible in the face of starvation and despair. The Americans, meanwhile, drew confidence from every engagement they survived. The jungle was a crucible, burning away weakness, leaving behind only those who could endure uncertainty. For the first time in the Pacific, Japanese troops felt the full weight of fear, not of death, but of being hunted. By the end of September 1942, the lines on Guadalcanal had hardened into a stalemate. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. The Japanese, once the aggressors, now fought on unfamiliar terms. The Americans, once the hunted, had learned to own the darkness. The stage was set for the next brutal phase, where tactics, technology, and sheer endurance would decide who would hold Guadalcanal. The tactical angle, adapting to a new kind of war. The American commanders on Guadalcanal quickly realized that traditional battle doctrine had little meaning in a jungle where visibility rarely exceeded 20 meters. Patrols operated more like hunters than soldiers, advancing cautiously through a maze of roots and vines. Small unit tactics replaced large-scale maneuvers. Squads learned to coordinate silently: hand signals, brief bursts of fire, immediate withdrawal. The Japanese, whose military ethos emphasized close-quarter combat and banzai charges, found this style of warfare disorienting. They were masters of infiltration at night but struggled against coordinated defensive systems, reinforced by artillery and air power. Colonel Merritt, Red Mike, Edson's defense of Lunga Ridge in September 1942 became a defining example. Under constant night attacks, his raiders and paratroopers held their position against waves of Japanese infantry charging through the darkness. Illumination flares turned the ridge into a haunting tableau, silhouettes of bayonets glinting against bursts of machine gun fire. Edson's men repelled every assault, demonstrating that discipline and fire control could overcome even the most fanatical enemy. From that night onward, the myth of unstoppable Japanese banzai tactics began to fade. The lesson spread quickly through the ranks. In the jungle, precision and patience beat speed and fury. The logistical angle, the battle of supply of courage won battles. Logistics decided wars. On Guadalcanal, every bullet, every ration, every gallon of fuel became a matter of life and death. The Americans held Henderson Field, the airstrip at the heart of the island. But keeping it supplied was an ordeal. Japanese naval forces controlled the surrounding waters by night, running high-speed Tokyo Express convoys to reinforce their troops. The U.S. Navy could only operate by day, risking air and sea attacks to bring in essential cargo. Each delivery ship that survived meant the Marines would eat another day. Each one sunk meant tighter belts and weaker men. For the Japanese, the situation was even worse. Their supply lines stretched thousands of miles, constantly harassed by American aircraft and submarines. By October, most Japanese troops on the island were surviving on half rations, then quarter rations. Many resorted to eating coconuts, captured supplies, or whatever they could scavenge from the jungle. Letters and diaries recovered later told the story in raw detail. Soldiers reduced to skin and bone, too weak to carry rifles, too delirious to fight. The jungle did not forgive inefficiency. The side that could sustain its men would outlast the one that could not. The leadership angle, command and chaos leadership on Guadalcanal, was a study in improvisation. Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, faced one of the most uncertain commands of the war. His men were exhausted, his supplies scarce, and his orders vague. Yet he remained steady, calm, and methodical. Vandegrift understood that morale was his greatest resource. He kept his men informed, not with grand speeches but with quiet reassurance. His leadership created a sense of trust that would become legendary in Marine Corps history. Opposite him, the Japanese High Command was plagued by miscommunication and arrogance. General Harukichi Hyakutake and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto both underestimated the determination of the Americans. Their belief that one strong push could retake Guadalcanal led to repeated offensives that ended in slaughter. Japanese intelligence had failed to grasp how deeply entrenched the Marines were, or how rapidly the Americans could adapt. By the time Tokyo realized the scale of the disaster, thousands of their best soldiers had already perished. On Guadalcanal, leadership was not measured in medals or proclamations. It was measured in the number of men who could still stand and fight when the sun rose. The technological angle, the power of air superiority when Maimi na Mar. The Marines first seized Henderson Field in August 1942. It was little more than a dirt runway. Within weeks, it became one of the most important air bases in the Pacific. Every morning, American planes roared off the runway to attack Japanese ships, positions, and reinforcements. They called themselves the Cactus Air Force, a makeshift group of Marine, Navy, and Army pilots flying whatever aircraft could be kept in the air. Their presence transformed the balance of power. By day, the skies belonged to the Americans. By night, the sea belonged to the Japanese. The Cactus Air Force's relentless strikes crippled the Tokyo Express convoys and destroyed countless enemy vessels. Each successful sortie meant fewer Japanese reinforcements reaching shore and more breathing room for the exhausted Marines. Japanese troops began to fear the sudden scream of diving bombers as much as they feared the jungle itself. For the first time, air power proved that it could dominate not just open battlefields but even remote island wars. Guadalcanal became a living experiment in combined arms, air, land, and sea forces operating in a single, unified rhythm. It was a new kind of warfare, one that would define the rest of the Pacific Campaign. By November 1942, the Americans had learned to use every advantage, terrain, technology, endurance, to their favor. The Japanese still fought ferociously, but their strength was fading. The war on Guadalcanal was no longer about conquest. It was about survival. The next phase would decide who would hold the island and who would leave it behind forever. By late October 1942, Guadalcanal had become more than an island campaign. It was the crucible of the Pacific War. Both sides were bleeding men and material into the dense jungles and dark waters that surrounded it. The stakes were now existential. Whoever held Guadalcanal would control the Solomon Islands, and with it, the gateway to Australia and the South Pacific. For Japan, losing it meant losing the offensive. For America, losing it meant losing the momentum gained since Midway. Everything converged on a series of desperate clashes between October and November, when discipline, courage, and sheer endurance would decide the outcome. The night assault on Henderson Field, the Japanese offensive on the night of October 24-25, 1942, was their most ferocious yet. 3 regiments of the 2nd Division, led by General Masao Maruyama, advanced through miles of jungle toward Henderson Field. They had been marching for days through torrential rain, their maps ruined, their food exhausted. Many had eaten nothing for 2 days before reaching their start lines. Their objective was simple: destroy the American airfield and annihilate the Marines defending it. But what awaited them was far from simple. Colonel Red Mike, Edson's Raiders and the 164th Infantry, fresh Army reinforcements, had fortified the perimeter. Trenches, barbed wire, and interlocking fields of machine gun fire guarded every approach. When the Japanese attacked, the night erupted in flashes of orange and white. The jungle became a hellscape of fire, screams, and explosions. Marines fired until their barrels glowed red. Japanese soldiers charged again and again, shouting battle cries that were lost in the roar of automatic fire. Those who made it past the wire were met with grenades and bayonets. Others crawled through the mud, only to be cut down by the steady rhythm of Browning machine guns. At dawn, hundreds of Japanese bodies lay scattered in front of the Marine lines. The survivors drifted back into the jungle, stunned, hungry, and broken. The attack had failed completely. Henderson Field still stood. It was a decisive moment, but the fighting was far from over. The naval battle for Guadalcanal begins. While the Marines fought in the mud, the waters off the island boiled with destruction. The Japanese Navy, desperate to reinforce their ground forces, launched repeated attempts to deliver men and supplies by sea. The Americans, equally determined, blocked every approach. On the night of November 12, 1942, radar screens aboard U.S. cruisers lit up with signals. Enemy ships approaching from the northwest. What followed was one of the most chaotic and brutal naval battles of World War II. The U.S. task force, led by Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, intercepted a Japanese bombardment group heading straight for Henderson Field. In the blackness of night, ships from both sides clashed at point-blank range. Searchlights stabbed through the darkness. Shells exploded at such close quarters that crews could see the faces of their enemies illuminated in the glare. The battle lasted less than an hour, but it was catastrophic. 2 American admirals, Callahan and Norman Scott, were killed. Several cruisers and destroyers were sunk. The Japanese battleship Hiei was crippled, burning fiercely before it was abandoned and scuttled. Both fleets withdrew, shattered, and bloodied. But the result was clear. The Japanese bombardment had failed. Henderson Field was still operational. For the exhausted Marines, that meant one thing. The Cactus Air Force would fly again in the morning. The sea turns red. The second naval clash. 2 nights later, on November 14-15, the Japanese made one final attempt to land troops and destroy the airfield. This time, their force included 2 massive battleships, Kirishima and Haruna, escorted by cruisers and destroyers. Opposing them was a small American force led by Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee, centered around the new fast battleships Washington and South Dakota. In the moonlit darkness, the 2 fleets closed in on each other, unaware that they were on a collision course. At 23:17, radar operators aboard Washington detected the enemy. Moments later, the night erupted again. Tracers, flares, and the thunder of heavy shells filled the air. South Dakota took multiple hits and went silent. But Washington, unseen in the confusion, maneuvered into position. Then she opened fire. Her 16-inch guns unleashed a barrage that ripped through Kirishima, striking her with more than 20 hits in minutes. The Japanese battleship was set ablaze, her crew desperately fighting fires that could not be controlled. By 3 a.m., she rolled over and sank beneath the waves. For the first time, an American battleship had destroyed a Japanese capital ship in a night surface action, using radar-guided fire. It was a turning point in naval warfare. Technology and training had begun to outweigh experience and audacity. The Japanese fleet retreated once again. Henderson Field remained intact. The collapse of the Japanese offensive on land, the failure of the sea operations sealed the fate of the Japanese troops. With their supply lines severed, their artillery destroyed, and their reinforcements lost to the depths, starvation became their new enemy. By late November, the average Japanese soldier on Guadalcanal weighed less than 100 pounds. Some were found dead beside rivers, still clutching empty canteens. Entire companies disappeared into the jungle, lost to disease and exhaustion. American patrols began to find abandoned camps, rifles rusted, and personal diaries scattered among the trees. The words inside spoke of despair, hunger, homesickness, the shame of defeat. Those still fighting did so out of sheer willpower. They launched small raids, often suicidal, against American positions. But the firepower imbalance was now overwhelming. Every attack was met by coordinated artillery, mortars, and aircraft. The Marines, reinforced now by Army divisions, pressed forward. The jungle that had once concealed the Japanese was now their grave. Guadalcanal was becoming an American island. The struggle, however, was not yet over. Tokyo had not accepted defeat, and the Imperial Navy was preparing one final desperate attempt to evacuate its surviving forces, an operation that would test the limits of courage and endurance on both sides. The last act of Guadalcanal was about to begin, and not a fight for victory, but a fight to survive. By December 1942, the battle for Guadalcanal had entered its final harrowing stage. What had begun 4 months earlier as a campaign for control of an airfield had evolved into a struggle that tested the endurance of entire nations. Both sides were exhausted, but only one could hold the island. The Japanese High Command, now fully aware of the disaster unfolding, faced a grim decision. Reinforcement was no longer possible. Supply routes were collapsing under relentless American air and sea pressure. Troops were dying faster from starvation and disease than from enemy bullets, and yet, Emperor Hirohito's generals refused to accept the humiliation of withdrawal, at least not publicly. Operation KE, a plan to secretly evacuate the remaining Japanese forces under the illusion of reinforcement, was born in desperation. It would be one of the most daring naval operations of the Pacific War. The deception of Operation Kion, January 14, 1943. Tokyo gave the order. The Imperial Navy would begin withdrawing troops from Guadalcanal. But to deceive the Americans, the operation would be disguised as yet another reinforcement mission. Destroyers, sleek, fast, and armed to the teeth, would serve as evacuation transports. They would slip into Guadalcanal by night, load troops from the beaches, and disappear before dawn. The Americans, however, were watching. Their reconnaissance planes tracked the movements of Japanese ships assembling at Rabaul. Their radio intercept units picked up fragments of coded messages suggesting a new offensive. To them, it looked like the Japanese were preparing another all-out assault. So while the Imperial Navy was planning an escape, the U.S. commanders braced for one last attack. It was a strange inversion, both sides misreading the other's intent, both believing the next phase would decide everything. On the ground, the exhausted Japanese soldiers, what remained of them, waited. Many were too weak to stand. Their uniforms hung loose on skeletal bodies. Some crawled to the beach under the cover of darkness, clutching rifles they no longer had the strength to use. For them, survival had become the only objective. The evacuation begins on the night of February 1, 1943. The first destroyers of Operation KE appeared offshore. Their sleek silhouettes glided through the surf as landing craft and barges made their way toward the beaches. The Japanese soldiers, gaunt and trembling, waded through waist-deep water to reach them. Some collapsed before they could climb aboard. Others wept silently as they left the island, not from relief but from shame. In just a few hours, the ships vanished back into the black horizon. The Americans, believing it was another Tokyo Express run, launched air attacks the next morning. But the destroyers were already gone. The evacuation continued for 2 more nights, carried out with near-perfect precision. The Japanese Navy, despite overwhelming American surveillance, managed to extract over 10,000 men from the island without the Allies realizing the true nature of the operation. It was one of the few tactical successes Japan achieved in the aftermath of Guadalcanal, but it came at a terrible cost. Over 30,000 Japanese soldiers had been sent to the island since August 1942. Barely 1/3 returned alive. The last American pushes. The Japanese withdrew. American forces advanced cautiously through the jungle, expecting ambushes that never came. Patrols found abandoned positions, broken artillery pieces, and empty supply caches. The smell of death hung heavy in the humid air. By February 9, 1943, Major General Patch, now commanding American forces on the island, reported to Admiral William Halsey, "Guadalcanal is secure." Those 4 words marked the end of one of the most brutal campaigns of World War II. For the Marines who had fought since August, there was no celebration, only exhaustion. They had endured disease, hunger, and unrelenting combat in an environment that seemed to fight them as fiercely as the enemy. Out of the 60,000 Americans who served on the island, over 7,000 were killed or wounded, but Their victory had changed everything. Guadalcanal was the first major land defeat of the Japanese Empire, the first time their expansion had been decisively halted and reversed. The psychological impact rippled far beyond the Solomon Islands. For the first time, the Allies had proven that the Japanese military could be beaten in a sustained campaign. The myth of invincibility, the belief that Japanese soldiers would never yield, and was shattered. On the beaches and in the jungles of Guadalcanal, echoes of defeat for the Japanese. Survivors evacuated to Rabaul. The reality of what they had endured began to sink in. Many were hospitalized immediately upon arrival, suffering from malaria, dysentery, and starvation. Entire regiments had been reduced to a few hundred men. Officers who once commanded thousands now led remnants. Their diaries spoke of guilt, confusion, and disbelief. They had fought with valor, but valor could not overcome logistics and attrition. Guadalcanal forced the Imperial Army to confront its own limitations, a reckoning long delayed by its early successes in the war. Back in Tokyo, the government censored the true scale of the loss. Official announcements spoke vaguely of a strategic withdrawal, but within military circles, the truth was undeniable. The tide of the Pacific War had turned. From that moment on, Japan would fight on the defensive, a turning of eras. When the last shots faded over Guadalcanal, the world's perception of the Pacific changed. Until then, the Imperial Japanese forces had seemed unstoppable, their tactics precise, their soldiers fearless, their victories swift. But Guadalcanal revealed something deeper. Beneath that discipline lay vulnerability. The Americans had matched Japanese courage with endurance, matched their aggression with adaptability, and matched their ferocity with technology. And perhaps most importantly, they had learned. From jungle warfare to night fighting, from supply coordination to air superiority, Guadalcanal became the textbook for every Pacific operation that followed, from Tarawa to Saipan to Okinawa. It was not only the Marines who emerged stronger from the ordeal. The entire Allied war machine was reborn from the mud, the fear, and the fire of that island. The campaign ended not with a single battle, but with the slow realization that Japan's offensive empire was dying, and America's long road to victory had begun. In the smoldering silence of February 1943, Guadalcanal stood as both a graveyard and a beginning, an island carved into history by those who endured its horrors. But while the fighting had stopped, the consequences had only begun. The aftermath of Guadalcanal would reshape the Pacific theater and the world in ways no one on that jungle island could yet imagine. When the gunfire finally ceased and the jungle fell silent, Guadalcanal was unrecognizable. The once lush green island had been reduced to a landscape of craters, rusted metal, and broken men. Coconut palms lay shattered, rivers ran brown with silt and fuel, and the air still carried the acrid scent of gunpowder. For 6 months, the island had consumed everything thrown at it: ships, planes, soldiers, and hope. Now it stood as a monument to endurance, the cost of victory. The American victory came at a price few were prepared to reckon with. Over 7,100 Allied troops were killed, and more than 29,000 wounded or stricken by disease. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical fevers had nearly crippled entire units. Some battalions had lost more men to illness than to enemy fire, yet the losses paled compared to the toll on Japan. Of the 31,000 Japanese soldiers sent to Guadalcanal, nearly 21,000 never returned. Most died not in battle but from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Their bodies, unburied and uncounted, were left to the jungle. Post-war Japanese reports called Guadalcanal the graveyard of the Imperial Army. The Americans buried their dead in neat rows along the shore before the survivors were evacuated for rest and medical care. For the Marines who had endured the campaign from its first days, there was no sense of triumph, only quiet disbelief that they had survived at all. Corporal Harold A. Piper of the 1st Marine Division wrote home, "We came here as boys. We leave as ghosts." Strategic consequences. The capture of Guadalcanal marked the first significant Allied land victory in the Pacific, a psychological and strategic pivot that rippled across both hemispheres. Before Guadalcanal, Japan had seemed unstoppable, sweeping through Southeast Asia and the Pacific with alarming speed. Their victories had created an aura of invincibility. Guadalcanal shattered that illusion. The island became the first major point on the map where Japan's expansion stopped and began to retreat. For the Allies, it proved that their new strategy of island hopping could work. Instead of engaging every Japanese stronghold, the U.S. could leapfrog strategically important islands, cut off supply lines, and isolate enemy bases. Guadalcanal became the blueprint for campaigns to come. New Georgia, Bougainville, Tarawa, the Gilberts, and beyond. On the Japanese side, the loss forced the Imperial General Headquarters to reevaluate its entire war plan. Admiral Yamamoto, who had once promised that Japan would dominate the Pacific, now faced a sobering reality. American industry, logistics, and manpower were overwhelming. Guadalcanal had revealed what Japan's militarists refused to acknowledge, that the empire could not sustain a prolonged war of attrition. The shift in command and perception. Within Japan's high command, the fallout was immediate. Commanders associated with the campaign were quietly reassigned or disgraced. The defeat was never fully disclosed to the public, but the whispers spread through Tokyo. The army had failed, the navy had bled dry, and the new order in Asia was faltering. For the Allies, Guadalcanal turned previously cautious leaders into believers. Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur now saw that the Japanese could be beaten on land, sea, and air simultaneously. The psychological confidence that emerged from Guadalcanal was as vital as the victory itself. It also elevated the reputation of the United States Marine Corps to near mythic status. The word Marine now carried new meaning, synonymous with tenacity, adaptability, and endurance under impossible conditions. War correspondents who arrived in the aftermath described the Marines as men who had wrestled with hell and returned with the 1,000-yard stare. Their stories of foxholes filled with water, of fighting malaria and hunger, of holding a line against endless waves, spread across America's newspapers and newsreels. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the American public could believe in victory. The human toll, the jungle, indifferent to ideology, consumed all who entered it. Both American and Japanese bodies were swallowed by the tropical growth within weeks. Artillery shells and rusted helmets became part of the landscape. Local Solomon Islanders who had watched the war unfold across their homeland faced devastation of their own. Entire villages were destroyed, fishing grounds poisoned, and farmlands turned into battlefields. Many worked as guides and scouts for the Allies, unsung heroes who navigated the terrain, carried messages, and rescued downed pilots. Their contribution, often overlooked, was indispensable. One local recalled years later, "We did not fight, but the war fought around us." The beginning of Japan's long retreat by early 1943, Japan's once mighty navy was on the defensive, forced to conserve ships and fuel. Their aircraft losses at Guadalcanal, over 900 planes destroyed, crippled their ability to contest the skies in future campaigns. America, on the other hand, was only growing stronger. Factories in Detroit, Seattle, and San Diego were producing ships and planes faster than Japan could sink or shoot them. Guadalcanal had proven that time was now the Allies' greatest weapon. From this point forward, every Japanese commander knew the war had changed. The empire's vast perimeter was shrinking, slowly, inexorably, island by island. But while the strategic tide had turned, the psychological aftermath of Guadalcanal lingered for years. The men who survived carried its ghosts long after the war ended. For them, the campaign was not just history. It was a memory carved into their bones, and yet, for both sides, there remained a final reckoning. What this battle truly meant for humanity, warfare, and the course of history itself. The story of Guadalcanal did not end with victory parades or medals. It lingered, in the minds of those who fought, in the halls of power that studied its lessons, and in the hearts of families waiting for sons who would never return. The island had changed the trajectory of the Second World War, but it had also changed the men who survived it. Lessons in modern warfare, Guadalcanal was more than a military triumph. It was a transformation in the way wars were fought and understood. Before 1942, large-scale amphibious operations were considered almost impossible. No modern army had ever successfully sustained one under fire across thousands of miles of ocean. Guadalcanal changed that forever. The campaign became a living laboratory for combined operations, integrating naval power, ground forces, and air superiority into a single, coordinated machine. Every mistake made there was studied, corrected, and adapted into doctrine. By the time the Allies invaded Tarawa and the Marianas, the lessons of Guadalcanal had become standard practice. The need for supply coordination, medical infrastructure, reliable air cover, and naval gunfire support. In short, Guadalcanal taught the Allies how to fight and win across an entire ocean. For the Japanese, it exposed the fatal weaknesses of their war machine, inadequate logistics, underestimation of the enemy, and blind adherence to offensive spirit over sustainable strategy. Their commanders had believed courage could overcome hunger, that determination could substitute for fuel and ammunition. The jungle proved them wrong. After Guadalcanal, Japan would never again launch a major offensive in the Pacific. Psychological shifts in propaganda. The psychological impact of Guadalcanal rippled far beyond the battlefield. In Japan, the government censorship machine worked furiously to conceal the defeat. Newspapers spoke of strategic realignments and temporary withdrawals, but in private, military leaders knew the truth. Officers who returned from the island were ordered not to speak of their experiences. Letters from the front were quietly destroyed, and yet the defeat was undeniable. Families noticed the growing silence, the lack of triumph in official announcements. The aura of Japan's invincibility, carefully cultivated since 1937, had been shattered. In the United States, Guadalcanal became a rallying cry. Newsreels showed Marines slogging through mud, naval guns thundering at sea, and fighter planes streaking over palm trees. America, once uncertain and defensive, now believed in its capacity to win. President Roosevelt described Guadalcanal as America's first offensive step toward total victory. The victory also restored the morale of Allied nations. Australia, under constant fear of invasion, saw Guadalcanal as the barrier that had saved its northern shores. The British, struggling in Europe, viewed it as proof that Japan's power could be broken. From a small, obscure island in the Solomons, hope had begun to radiate outward. The forgotten cost, the human wounds even as victory took shape. The personal cost endured. Veterans of Guadalcanal returned home physically present but emotionally distant. Many carried malaria for years. Others carried memories they could never explain. The constant tension of jungle combat, the fear of ambush, the nightly bombardments, the sight of starvation and death left invisible scars. Medical officers began noting what they called combat fatigue, the early understanding of what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. Letters home revealed exhaustion and guilt. Some Marines confessed that they could no longer sleep without hearing insects and artillery in the same breath. Others admitted they felt lost without the adrenaline of battle. Japanese survivors faced an even darker aftermath. Those who escaped Guadalcanal often felt shame instead of relief. Their Bushido code had taught them that surrender was dishonor, but they had been ordered to retreat. Many spent the rest of their lives haunted by the memory of comrades who had died of hunger while they were evacuated. In both nations, Guadalcanal became less a story of triumph than of endurance. The strategic domino effect, the fall of Guadalcanal, set off a chain reaction across the Pacific. The Allies immediately began new operations across the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Each advance cut deeper into Japan's defensive perimeter. The once formidable Japanese Navy now fought to delay, not to dominate. By mid-1943, American bombers were reaching the Marshall Islands. By 1944, they were striking the Marianas, and Japan itself was within range. Guadalcanal had been the opening blow in what became an unbroken sequence of Allied victories. The empire that had stretched across the Pacific in 1941 was collapsing, one island at a time. For Japan, Guadalcanal was more than a military loss. It was the moment their dream of expansion died. For America, it was the moment that dream of victory was born. Remembrance today, Guadalcanal remains quiet. The jungle has reclaimed much of what was lost. Tanks buried under vines, rusted helmets hidden beneath the soil, airfields now softened by grass. Each year, Veterans and their families return to the island. Some come to honor their dead. Others come simply to understand what happened there. The Solomon Islanders still find relics, bullets, dog tags, bones, rising from the ground after heavy rains. Each discovery is a reminder that history still breathes beneath the surface. On the 50th anniversary of the battle, American and Japanese veterans stood side by side at a memorial near Henderson Field. One Japanese survivor said softly, "We were enemies then. Now we are both old men. The jungle took more from us than we ever gave to each other." That sentiment, quiet, heavy with truth, captured what Guadalcanal ultimately meant. It was not just a battle for territory. It was a test of human endurance, faith, and survival against an environment and an enemy that seemed impossible. The jungle at last had gone silent. But history would never forget what it had witnessed there, the moment when fear turned to resilience, when defeat became determination, and when an island called Guadalcanal changed the fate of the Pacific forever.